May I, Your Honor?
Yes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Would you please introduce yourself to the jurors by telling us your name and spell your last name?
Yes, my name is Robert Welton, W-E-L-T-O-N.
And are you employed, sir?
I am.
By whom?
The Commonwealth of Massachusetts Office of the Chief Medical Examiner.
How long have you worked there?
It'll be 10 years in July.
What's your current role at the OCME?
I'm the Deputy Chief Medical Examiner.
All right. And could you describe your educational background, please, for everybody?
Sure. I have a bachelor's and master's degree in biology from the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. I have a Master of Public Health and Epidemiology and Biostatistics from Boston University. I have a PhD in biology from Boston College, and I have my medical degree from the University of Illinois in Chicago.
Thank you. Can you describe some of your academic appointments that you've held in the past?
Sure. As a resident in pathology, I had held a instructor and a clinical associate position through Tufts University School of Medicine.
And any prior military service?
Yes, I had spent approximately 11 years in the Massachusetts Air National Guard and 3 years on active duty with the U.S. Navy.
And in what capacity were you with the military?
I was a transportation officer with the Air National Guard, and I was a biochemist with the Navy.
And do you hold any professional certifications and licenses?
I do. I have a full active medical license in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and I am certified in public health.
And do you still belong to professional organizations?
Yes, I do.
And which ones?
I belong as a member of the National Association of Medical Examiners, the American Medical Association, the Massachusetts Medical Society, and the Society of Forensic Toxicology, amongst others.
Thank you. Aside from your academic background, is there certain specialized training that one has to undergo or go through in order to be certified to do the work that you do?
Yes. So I had done a clinical year, intern year in anesthesiology, followed by 4 years of training at Bay State Medical Center in pathology, and then I did a year's fellowship in forensic pathology at the Commonwealth of Massachusetts OCME Medical Examiner.
Thank you. Just so we're all clear, pathology is a specialized field?
Correct.
Which studies what?
Human disease.
Thank you. And could you just describe the overall nature of your work as a medical examiner?
Yes. So my job as a medical examiner here in Western Massachusetts is to examine the cases that are assigned to our office and to ultimately determine cause and manner of death.
All right. And how, and this is, you can answer this, but how many autopsies do you think you've performed over the course of the years? And again, roughly.
In the 4,000 or so cases that I've done in the past 10 years, probably about half of those have been autopsies.
Okay. And have you testified before in this capacity as a medical examiner regarding your findings and conclusions of autopsies?
Yes.
And again, do you know, could you estimate perhaps how many times?
30 to 50 at this point.
All right, thank you. Now I want to turn your attention specifically to the reason we're here today. Did you have an occasion to perform an autopsy on January 15th of 2019?
I did.
And where did you perform that autopsy?
The autopsy that you're referring to was performed at our Holyoke facility.
Okay. And who was that autopsy performed on?
Alexis Avery.
All right. And are autopsies assigned a specific laboratory or case number in your office?
They are.
And was this assigned a specific case number?
It was.
Do you recall what that was, or do you have a note that would help you?
Yes, it's 2019-583.
All right. And before we get into specifics, just walk us through the general process. Where do you begin with an autopsy, and kind of what are you looking for in general?
Sure. So all of our cases begin with a review of whatever preliminary information is called into our office. It may be medical information, it may be police information, scene information. Once that is reviewed, the next step is to determine a plan of action for the autopsy. Once down in the autopsy room, there's an overall review of the individual that I'll be examining, which will include photographs and an external head-to-toe examination. Once that is done, we move to the internal examination, which is the bulk of the autopsy. Again, that is a head-to-toe examination where all organ systems are examined. It may also include ancillary testing such as tissue for microscopy, toxicology, in radiology, and all of that leads up to ultimately determine the cause and manner of death for that specific case.
That's your ultimate goal in performing an autopsy, correct?
That's correct.
All right. And so in this case, can you just tell us a brief, did you perform an external examination of Alexis Avery?
I did.
And what were your initial observations of Ms. Avery?
Initially, what had appeared were several what I thought at the time were sharp force injuries. There were also what I had called blunt force injuries as well, scattered on the body.
How did the body present to you?
The body presented after coming into our office. I can't recall at this time if she was clothed or not. At some point that would have been removed prior to me doing my examination.
And when you examine a body, do you make note of whether or not it's well preserved or refrigerated, embalmed, things like that?
I do.
And did you make note in this case?
I did.
And what do you recall?
She was refrigerated because she had been in our office and she was not embalmed.
All right. And was the body in sufficient condition that you could perform an examination?
Yes.
All right. And did you note things like livor mortis and rigor mortis, those sorts of things?
I did.
First of all, can you just tell us what those terms mean?
Sure. So we'll start with rigor mortis. Once an individual has passed away, there are some physiologic changes that happen in the body, and the ultimate result of that is your muscles will stiffen up and you won't be able to move them. So that's rigor mortis. Livor mortis is another physiologic response from the heart stopping and the blood not pumping through the body. And what then happens is the blood will pool based on gravity. So for example, if you die on your back, the blood will pool towards your back. That's livor mortis.
Okay. And I just want to ask you generally about time of death. On TV, you get a specific time of death in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Tell us
Sure.
Tell us why that's not necessarily true.
So the time of death is a multifactorial determination, and it requires a lot of input from the scene. So what was the person's physiological state at the time of death? What was the temperature in the environment at the person's time of death? Were they refrigerated or subject to a different temperature prior to us receiving the body? So there's a lot of external factors that can play into it. There are some general changes that have time frames, but I generally use them as ranges versus the person died at 4:30 a.m. or whatever. I'll usually give more of a range because of that.
In this particular case, are you able to tell us specifically what time Alexis Avery died?
I was not.
And I believe you already mentioned this, but as a part of your examination, are photographs taken of the individual that you're examining?
Yes.
And is that an important part of preserving and documenting what you observe?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to show you 12 images. I just want you to look at them, not comment yet, but just tell me if you recognize the images depicted here.
Yes, I recognize them.
What do you recognize those images to be, Doctor?
Photos from the autopsy of Alexis Avery.
Are they a fair and accurate depiction of the injuries that you observed and described in your report?
Yes.
May I move to offer these as the Commonwealth's next exhibits?
Show them to counsel first, and I will tell you, members of the jury, probably yesterday I gave you an instruction regarding photographs. I just want to remind you of that. You're about to see photographs that will be marking evidence in the case. you must view those photographs calmly, coolly, and without emotion, even though some may be unpleasant or graphic. You must not allow now or during your deliberations sympathy or pity, which may be occasioned by these photographs, to interfere with your task of rationally considering all the evidence. Consider these exhibits only as they draw attention to clinical medical status, the nature of the injuries, and the positioning of any entry of any projectile in this case. So with that, Mr. Green, go ahead. They may be marked.
Subject to previous.
Subject to the previous injections, right?
It'll be 69 through 80.
69 through 80.
Just receive sidebar.
Let me ask you this, Doctor. Were you able to determine the number of wounds that Miss Avery sustained?
Yes.
And what was the overall number?
As far as sharp force injuries, there were 28, I believe.
All right. And in your report, I think it makes sense to hear, you kind of discussed them in groups, is that right?
Correct.
All right. So the first injuries you noted were sharp force injuries to the head and neck, is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. I'm now showing exhibit number 69. I think you have a monitor there, Doctor. Can you tell me what's depicted in exhibit 69?
Yes, these are the wounds that I had described in the report on the right side of the Miss Avery's face and neck.
All right. And the indications, the letters that are also apparent, did you put those there?
I did.
And why is that?
To basically catalog each of the individual wounds.
Okay. And when you say a sharp force injury, what do you mean by that specifically?
So injuries are generally classified into two categories, blunt and sharp. And a blunt force injury is an injury not caused by something sharp. So sharp would include incisional type wounds, stab wounds, anything basically caused by a sharp object.
And were you able to measure the depth of these wounds?
I was.
Could you, I don't know, so let's start with A. Could you tell us the depth of injury A?
A was about 1/4 of an inch deep.
How about injury B?
3/8 of an inch deep.
How about C?
3/8 of an inch deep.
Injury D?
3/8 of an inch.
Injury E?
5/8 of an inch.
Injury F?
1 inch.
Okay. How about G?
G, G is a superficial wound, so it was not very deep.
Okay. And what about H?
Same thing, also a superficial wound, not very deep.
Okay. It's I'm going to show you number 7 now. These depict other portions of injury, is that correct?
That's correct.
And what letter do we have here?
That is a J.
All right. And describe injury J, if you can.
J is it's a sharp force injury that involves the corner of the right side of the mouth and damage to the internal structures of the mouth as well.
Okay. And this is Exhibit 71. Let me make sure I have it pointed correctly. What is this injury here?
That is, I believe, that is wound H. It's either H or I can't tell with
Let
the...
me go back to, this is 69 again. And there's one here and one kind of under here. I guess they
Okay.
could both be an H or an I.
Correct. So the one on the neck next to G is H, and the
Okay.
one on the chin is I.
All right, so now let's go to that. This is I, then, right?
So that is I, correct.
Okay. And what can you tell from that injury?
So that is also a sharp force injury. Basically in the sort of the skin folds underneath Miss Avery's chin, and it was about a ½ an inch deep.
Did you make any subsidiary findings regarding these wounds?
Yes.
What were those?
So there was damage to the soft tissue, including skin, fat, muscle in the neck and the face. More specifically, in the cluster of the wounds on the right side of the neck, there was damage to the muscle underneath the sternocleidomastoid mastoid muscle, as well as damage to the external jugular vein.
Okay, and one more time, this is 69. Can you tell which of those affected the jugular vein, or are you just talking about one of them?
So there are two possibilities. Wound E and wound F both have sufficient depth, and they're in the proximate area. So it would most likely be either of those that caused that deeper damage.
And could you describe for us what is the jugular?
Sure. So there are several vessels going into the brain and coming out of the brain. The carotid arteries going in and the jugular veins, both the internal and external jugulars are the vessels that the blood leaves the head through. And the right external jugular vein, in this case, was the one that was injured.
Okay. Could any of those injuries in and of themselves been potentially fatal?
Yes.
And can you narrow that down, or just potentially any of those?
The two that were closest in proximity to the external jugular vein, the E and the F, are likely the ones that would have been more fatal.
Okay. Now I'm going to move on to injuries of the torso.
Sure.
Is that the next category that you discussed in your findings?
It is.
All right, so now this is 72. Let me go. There we go. All right, so this is Exhibit 72. It's a little bit hard to see from the glare, but what injuries are depicted in this?
So there are multiple injuries here. The two top ones, L and M, are to the chest area, and N through Q are to the abdomen.
Okay. Did you make any findings about injury M?
Yes.
What can you tell us about injury M?
M is N is what I would call a stab wound. It's about 1/4 inch deep. It doesn't necessarily penetrate into the body cavities. It's more superficial.
Going to display 73, please, for you, doctor. And just orient yourself to that. What injury are we looking at here?
That's injury N.
Okay, and it seems common sense, but is this ruler just to help you understand dimensions?
Yes.
And what can you tell me about injury N?
So injury N also would be a stab wound, and there's a bit of what I call a tail. So if you're looking at the screen, that side or my right side, there's a little bit of what's a superficial incisional type wound. This wound is deep enough that it actually penetrates into the abdominal cavity, and actually the wound track goes into some of the organs within the cavity.
And were you able to determine which organs it may have affected?
I was.
What are those?
The left lobe of the liver, the pancreas, the small intestine, the junction of the aorta and the artery feeding the kidney, one of the kidneys, and it also hit part of the left kidney as well.
In your opinion, is that wound in and of itself potentially fatal?
Yes.
Displaying for you further torso pictures, this is Exhibit 75. Can you see that, Doctor?
I can.
And are there injuries you noted in this picture, 75?
Yes.
And where are we looking here on the body?
So Miss Avery is lying in the prone position, which means on her stomach. So where you see why, that would actually be her right shoulder. So the injuries that you're seeing labeled further down on the back are on the right side.
Okay. And that'd be Z, AA, and AB?
Correct.
This is Exhibit 76, showing why. Did you make any determinations about injury Y?
Yes, injury Y is also a stab wound, but it is relatively superficial and it does not penetrate into the chest cavity.
And back to 75, what about these other injuries, Z, AA, and AB? Did you make determinations regarding those injuries?
I did.
What were those?
These also stab wounds, relatively superficial, only going into the soft tissue of the back, not into the cavity.
Did you examine Miss Avery's extremities, meaning arms?
I did.
Did she have injuries on her extremities?
She did on the upper extremities.
All right. I'm showing you Exhibit 79. Can you see what's depicted in that?
Yes.
All right. What letters are denoted in this particular image?
I am seeing R, S, T, U, and V.
Okay. And did you make subsidiary findings or conclusions about any of those injuries?
Yes, these are also stab wounds. S is probably a combination of a stab and an incisional wound because of the superficial nature of it. I determined that they all go into the soft tissue and they all have varying depths.
Okay. Were we able to determine the depths of some of these injuries?
Yes.
And how about R?
R, about a ½ an inch in depth.
What about injury S?
So S, it looks deep, but it really only penetrates into the fat and the skin.
Okay. And what about T, U, and V?
T, T is superficial, again, only into the skin and soft tissue, as are both U and V.
Okay. This is Exhibit 74, Injury K. What are we looking at there?
K, let's see. K is back on the torso. It's basically on the right side of the chest on the lateral aspect, or the aspect that would be closest to the armpit.
Okay. And so in general, these cluster of injuries on Exhibit 79, those injuries to the extremity.
Yes.
Are you familiar with the term defensive wound?
Yes.
And can you tell us, can you form an opinion as to whether or not these injuries may be consistent with defensive wounds?
They could be consistent with defensive wounds.
And how would that be?
So defensive wounds are basically injuries that are sustained when you're trying to defend yourself. And by looking at the position of where they are on the arm, they could in fact have been caused by that defensive type of movement on Miss Avery's part.
Did Miss Avery also suffer from some blunt force injuries?
Yes.
And again, just what is the distinction? What is a blunt force injury?
So as I had said earlier, sharp versus blunt. Blunt is an injury that isn't caused by something sharp. That would include bruises, scrapes, abrasions, lacerations, something that's either caused by a dragging motion or a blunt impact of the skin.
Okay. And did you observe blunt force injuries to Miss Avery?
I did.
And where did you observe those?
There was an abrasion on her head. There were bruises on her arms and her legs.
Okay. Are those blunt force injuries, in your opinion, contributory to her cause of death?
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
I'm going to show you two other quick pictures. This is 81, and is that another, what area of the body are we looking at here?
That, I believe, is so up on the corner where the ruler is, that is the palm side of one of the hands. Excuse me.
And so then this injury here would be slightly below the palm area.
That's correct.
And number 82, can you please tell me about where that injury is located?
So this is one of the hands, and the X is overlying what appears to be from this photograph a sharp force injury of the fifth digit, the pinky finger.
As part of your examination, do you take blood samples?
Yes.
And where do you normally take blood samples from in an autopsy?
So blood is generally taken, excuse me, if I can, I try to get it from the heart, one of the peripheral vessels like the femoral artery, subclavian artery, if I can. If I can't, depending upon the situation, and there's pooled blood in one of the body cavities, I will take it from there as well.
Were you able to take blood from the heart of Miss Avery?
I was not.
And why is that?
There was approximately 1,200 milliliters of blood in the chest cavity, and there wasn't any blood, residual blood left in the heart in sufficient quantity for me to take a sample.
So where did you take your sample from?
From the pooled cavity.
Did you send that out for toxicology testing?
Yes.
Do you recall what the results were, if there were any?
Yes, there was ethanol present and 2 metabolites of marijuana present.
And in your opinion, did either of those things contribute to her cause of death?
No.
Did you go on to perform a detailed internal examination?
Yes.
And what are you looking for when you do that? Anything else?
So basically, disease processes, any trauma that may have been transmitted externally to internally, or any other types of anomalies that I might see in the organ systems.
Did that detailed internal examination reveal anything of significance to your findings?
Yes.
What was that?
So the injuries to the organs that I had mentioned previously, there was also injury to some of the soft tissue in the abdominal cavity that had caused bleeding. There was a sufficient amount of blood that I had mentioned, the 1,200 milliliters in the cavity, that was there as well.
Okay. And we've heard this phrase several times now, but cause of death. What do you mean by cause of death?
So cause of death, in the easiest sense of the definition, is what medical or reason that ultimately caused the person to die.
Okay. Were you able to determine that in this case?
I was.
And what is your opinion as to Ms. Avery's cause of death?
Her cause of death was signed out as complications of multiple sharp force injuries of the neck and torso.
And are you able to narrow that down to any one or two particular injuries, or is this just your overall opinion?
So the injuries, so it's an all-encompassing cause of death, but it was based on the injuries that I had mentioned impacted the external jugular vein, as well as the injuries that had impacted the liver and the organ systems that I had talked about earlier.
So several injuries.
Correct.
Based upon your examination, if you can you offer an opinion as to how long it might have taken for somebody to succumb to these wounds?
Given the organs that were impacted, we're talking not an extended period of time. We're talking on the order of several minutes. It's not an instant death, but it's also likely not to be a prolonged death because of the amount of bleeding that I had seen.
But it would have taken at least several minutes.
Yes.
Thank you, Doctor. I have no further questions.
Welcome.
So we're going to take our lunch break now then. It's 5:01. We're going to break for lunch.